It was one of those evenings when the sky looked like it couldn't decide between day and night. A wash of golden pink fading into deep blue. The city lights were just starting to flicker on, one by one, like quiet promises that life goes on. Sarah Jensen tightened her scarf as she stepped out of the small art studio downtown. She'd stayed late again, trying to finish a commission for a client in Chicago. Her fingers were stained with paint, her eyes tired, but her heart was light. Painting had always been her way of breathing. She smiled faintly as she walked toward the parking lot, her boots clicking against the pavement. The air smelled like winter crisp, with a hint of rain. That's when she saw him. A familiar black truck pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down, and she heard a voice she hadn't heard in years. "Need a ride, Sarah?" It was Ethan Miller. Her breath caught. Ethan, her college best friend. Her almost something. They'd lost touch 5 years ago after life, distance, and a few wrong choices got in the way. She hadn't expected to ever see him again. Especially not like this, leaning out of his truck, smiling in that same easy, boyish way she remembered. She hesitated for a second, then smiled back. "Ethan, what on earth are you doing here?" He chuckled softly. "Moved back a few months ago, saw you walking out and thought, well, some things never change, still working too late." Sarah laughed. The sound came out lighter than she expected. "And you still remember where I park?" "Some memories don't fade," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment longer than necessary. Something inside her shifted. A mix of nostalgia, surprise, and something she couldn't quite name. She opened the passenger door and climbed in. The truck smelled like pine and old leather, just like Ethan used to. The warmth hit her cheeks as the heater hummed to life as they drove through the winding streets of Seattle. The conversation flowed like a forgotten song. They talked about everything and nothing. Her art, his job as a civil engineer, their families, the places they'd both seen. Yet underneath the small talk, there was something else, a quiet current pulling them back toward a connection that had never really gone away. When they stopped at a red light near the bridge, the city skyline glittered on the water. Ethan glanced at her. "You know," he said softly, "I used to drive this route all the time after you left for New York. Guess I couldn't let go of the habit." Sarah turned to look at him. "Why?" He gave a half smile, eyes still on the road. "Because it reminded me of the night we said goodbye, and how I never really said what I wanted to." Her heart skipped. "And what was that?" Before he could answer, the light turned green. He smiled, not teasingly, but like a man who'd learned that timing matters more than words. "Maybe I'll tell you before the night ends." The truck rolled on, the road stretching ahead like an unwritten story. For a few minutes, neither spoke. The radio played a soft country song, one of those heartfelt ones about second chances and missed calls. Sarah stared out the window, her thoughts spinning. She remembered that last night, years ago, the rain, the half-packed suitcases, the way Ethan had stood in the doorway with a look she never forgot. She had been chasing dreams back then, desperate to prove herself in the art world. He had been the one steady thing in her life, and she'd walked away, and now here they were, older, wiser, maybe lonelier. "Do you ever think about how life just circles back sometimes?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked at her, then back at the road. "All the time. Sometimes I think we're given chances twice, just to see if we've learned anything." Sarah smiled faintly. "And have you?" He grinned. "Working on it." They both laughed, and for a brief second, it felt like they were 20 again, two friends driving nowhere, dreaming of everywhere. But something about tonight felt different. He wasn't just a memory anymore. As they neared her neighborhood, the air inside the truck grew quieter, more thoughtful. The hum of the tires, the soft glow from the dashboard, the way his hands rested on the steering wheel, everything felt strangely intimate. "Ethan," she began, her voice a little unsteady, "that night before I left, I always wondered what you were going to say." He didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened, eyes focused on the road. Then, as they pulled up outside her apartment building, he parked and turned to her. "I was going to ask you to stay," he said finally. "Not for me, just long enough to see if we were something worth holding on to." The silence that followed was thick with what-ifs and unspoken feelings. Sarah felt her throat tighten. "I think about that night too," she whispered, "more than I probably should." For a long moment, neither moved. The rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windshield. Ethan broke the silence first. "Guess we missed our moment back then." "Maybe," she said softly. "Or maybe it's finding us again." Their eyes met, and the world outside blurred. The sound of the rain, the glow of the streetlights, the quiet between them, it all folded into one perfect, suspended moment. Then Ethan smiled. That slow, familiar smile that always had the power to undo her. Maybe this drive home was meant to happen, he said quietly. Sarah didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Her heart already knew. And as she stepped out into the rain, she glanced back at him through the open door. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Sarah," he replied, his voice warm, steady, but with something unsaid lingering underneath. She closed the door, the sound echoing softly in the cool night air. Ethan watched her walk toward the building, the same way he had years ago, only this time, he wasn't ready to let her go again. As she disappeared through the doorway, he whispered to himself, "One drive home, and my life may never be the same again." Sarah couldn't sleep that night. The sound of the rain outside her window seemed to echo everything swirling inside her. The warmth of Ethan's voice, the way his eyes softened when he said her name, and that last line he'd whispered before she stepped out of his truck. "One drive home, and my life may never be the same again." It replayed in her mind like a song she couldn't stop humming. She sat up in bed, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the occasional drip of rain from the roof. Everything looked the same, the small stack of canvases by the wall, her half-finished painting on the easel, but she didn't feel the same. For the first time in years, she felt something stirring. She reached for her phone, tempted to text him, but stopped. What would she even say? "Thanks for the ride." That sounded too casual. "I missed you. Too much." Instead, she just stared at the dark screen and whispered to herself, "Don't overthink it, Sarah." But of course, she did. The next morning, sunlight streamed through her window, painting soft lines across her floor. Sarah dressed for work, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. Was he thinking about her too? She shook her head, trying to focus. It was just a ride, she told herself in the mirror. That's all. But her reflection didn't seem convinced. Later that afternoon, while she was finishing a painting at her studio, her phone buzzed. A message: "Ethan, coffee sometime. I owe you one for the free art show at your car window." She laughed softly. It was so him, always finding a way to turn awkward moments into something easy. She typed back before she could overthink it. "Sarah, only if you promise not to be late this time." His reply came seconds later. "Ethan, wouldn't dream of it." They met that evening at a small cafe near the water, a place they used to go back in college when life felt simpler. It hadn't changed much. Same wooden tables, same chalkboard menu, same soft music in the background. Ethan was already there when she arrived, wearing a navy sweater and that same smile that always made her heart skip a beat. He stood up as she approached, his eyes lighting up in a way that made it hard to look away. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," she replied. They sat by the window. The lake shimmered under the fading light outside, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "So," he began, "tell me something honest. Did you ever think we'd run into each other again?" Sarah thought about it. "Honestly, no. I thought that chapter was closed." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, me too. But then again, life's been surprising me lately." She smiled. "In good ways, I hope." He met her eyes, the best kind. Something about the way he said it made her heart flutter. She looked away, pretending to stir her coffee, but the warmth in her cheeks betrayed her. They talked for hours. About work, about how both of them had changed, about how little things like favorite songs and habits somehow stayed the same. At one point, Ethan laughed and said, "You still bite your lip when you're thinking too hard." She laughed too. "And you still notice everything?" It was easy, being around him, too easy, but as the evening stretched on, something deeper began to surface between them, something quiet, unspoken. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "You know, Sarah, I used to think we missed our chance. But now, I'm not so sure." She looked at him carefully. "What makes you say that?" "Because some people," he said slowly, "walk out of your life for a reason, and some walk back in for one." Her heart ached in that tender, uncertain way that only happens when something real starts to grow again. The cafe lights dimmed slightly as the night deepened. Sarah glanced outside. The rain had returned, soft and steady. She smiled faintly. "Looks like another rainy night." Ethan grinned. "Guess that's becoming our thing." When they finally stood to leave, he offered to walk her to her car. The air outside was cool and smelled of wet pavement and coffee beans. They walked side by side in silence, the rain misting gently between them. At her car, Sarah turned to him. "Thanks for the coffee." "Anytime," he said. Then, after a pause, "Sarah." "Yeah." He hesitated, then smiled. If I asked you for one more drive, not as friends, but as something, maybe more, would you say yes? Her heart skipped. I'd think about it, she said softly, smiling up at him. He nodded. Fair enough, I'll give you time. As she got into her car, Ethan waited until she turned on the headlights, then gave a small wave. She watched him in the rearview mirror as she drove off, standing there in the rain, smiling like he'd just rediscovered something he thought he'd lost forever. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her pulse quickening, because deep down, she already knew her answer, and she also knew one more drive with Ethan might change everything again. The following days passed slower than usual for Sarah. She went about her usual routine, teaching art classes in the mornings, working on client pieces in the afternoons, but every quiet moment seemed to carry the same thought: Ethan, his smile, his voice, the warmth of his presence that lingered even after he was gone. It had been years since anyone had made her feel that way, steady, seen, safe. Yet it was confusing. They had been friends once, close friends, and she remembered all too well how complicated that had become the last time she'd let her heart lean too far, so she tried to distract herself. She even told herself that maybe that coffee night was just nostalgia to old friends catching up. But every time she thought of his words, not as friends, but as something more, her heart answered before her logic could. She wanted to see him again. 2 evenings later, as Sarah was cleaning her brushes at the studio, her phone buzzed. It was Ethan. Ethan, you home yet? Thought you might want to take that drive tonight? Her heart skipped. He remembered. She typed back quickly. Sarah, you mean the one I was supposed to think about? Ethan, that's the one. I figured you've had enough time to think. She smiled, biting her lip the same way she always did when she was nervous but excited. Sarah, pick me up in 20. The night was cool and clear when his truck pulled up outside her building. This time, when Sarah stepped inside, she didn't feel like she was stepping into the past. It felt like something new. Something uncertain but beautiful. Ethan gave her that same easy grin. You look different tonight. Different good or different bad, she teased. Different like you're finally ready to say yes, he said softly. Her cheeks warmed. Maybe I am. They drove toward the outskirts of the city, where the lights faded and the road opened into quiet countryside. The moon hung low, silvering the fields and rooftops as they passed. For a while, they didn't talk. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of everything words couldn't quite hold. Finally, Ethan turned down a narrow road that led to the old lookout point, a place they used to go in college, back when they'd talk about dreams and someday plans. When they reached the top, he parked and turned off the engine. The world outside was still, the city lights glowing faintly in the distance. Sarah smiled softly. You still come up here? Sometimes, he said. It's quiet, helps me think. She looked out over the view, the stretch of highway, the river winding through the hills. It was beautiful, peaceful, and yet her heart raced. Ethan turned toward her, his tone gentle. You know, I used to imagine bringing you back here someday, not as the girl who left, but as the woman who found her way back. Her eyes met his. That's a lot to imagine. He smiled faintly. I had a lot of time to think. Sarah looked down at her hands. I wasn't fair to you back then. I was scared of settling, of losing myself, of needing someone too much. I know, he said quietly. And I wasn't ready either. I thought if I just waited long enough, life would line up perfectly. But it doesn't work like that, does it? She shook her head. No, it doesn't. There was a long pause, the kind that hangs between two people when something deep is shifting. Ethan leaned back slightly, watching her. So, what about now? Are you still scared? Sarah thought for a moment. The night air was cool, carrying the soft scent of pine and earth. I'm still scared, she admitted, but maybe this time, I don't want to run from it. He smiled, eyes soft. Good, because I don't plan on letting you run too far. She laughed quietly, that nervous, happy kind of laugh that sneaks out when your heart's caught between fear and joy. They sat there in the quiet, looking out at the stars. There was no need for grand confessions or promises, just two people rediscovering what it meant to feel alive again. After a while, Ethan turned to her and said, You know, that night I gave you a ride home. I didn't expect it to mean anything. I just wanted to say hi. But then you smiled, and suddenly it felt like 5 years hadn't passed at all. Sarah's voice was soft. Maybe that's what happens when something's real. Time can't really change it. He nodded. Yeah, maybe. The wind picked up slightly, brushing a loose strand of hair across her face. Ethan reached over instinctively, tucking it gently behind her ear. The touch was brief but electric, the kind that says everything words can't. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. Ethan smiled, his hand lingering for just a second. Guess I've been wanting to do that for a long time. Sarah looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. And what else have you been wanting to do? He chuckled softly, shaking his head. Maybe I'll save that for another drive. They both laughed, the kind of laughter that feels like relief, like hope, like something beginning. As they sat under the stars, Ethan started the engine again. Come on, he said, let's drive a little longer. The night's too good to end here. Sarah leaned back, smiling out the window as the truck rolled down the quiet road. The world felt bigger, lighter, like she was finally moving toward something instead of away from it, and deep down, she knew this wasn't just another night, it was the start of something that had been waiting for years to begin. The days that followed felt like a quiet, beautiful shift in Sarah's world, the kind you don't notice all at once, but feel in little ways. Morning coffee tasted warmer. Her walks to the studio felt lighter. Even the gray Seattle sky seemed softer. And somewhere between the hours of work and waiting, she realized something. Ethan had become part of her days again. Not in a loud, overwhelming way, but in the calm rhythm of messages, small moments, and those late-night calls that seemed to stretch into forever. It felt easy, dangerously easy. One Thursday evening, he texted her while she was cleaning her studio. Ethan, you still at work? Sarah, of course. Artists never sleep. Ethan, good, because I've got a surprise. Sarah, a good one or a complicated one? Ethan, you'll have to find out. 20 minutes later, his truck was waiting outside again. She stepped in, smiling. You and your surprises. He grinned, handing her a small paper bag. Before we go anywhere, dinner. She peeked inside. Grilled cheese and tomato soup. Your favorite, he said. I remembered. Sarah laughed softly. You always did. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, eating from takeout cups and laughing over old stories, how she once painted his dorm door bright yellow as a joke. How he helped her move into her first apartment and accidentally dropped her favorite mug. It felt natural, familiar, like slipping back into a melody they both knew by heart. But then, the drive turned quiet again, not awkward, but thoughtful. The kind of silence that asks questions neither of them were ready to answer out loud. Finally, Ethan spoke. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't left back then? Sarah stared out the window, her voice soft. All the time. What do you think would have happened? She thought for a moment. We probably would have tried to make it work. Maybe it would have fallen apart anyway. Maybe I needed to leave to know what I was missing. Ethan nodded slowly. And what was that? She turned to look at him. You. The words slipped out before she could stop them. He froze. Just for a second, his expression a mix of surprise and something deeper. Then he smiled faintly. That's funny. Why? Because I was just about to say the same thing. The air between them changed, gentle but charged. Like the space between two waves before they crashed together. Neither of them said anything for a while. The road stretched out ahead, glowing softly under the streetlights. Finally, Ethan pulled over near the edge of a quiet lake, the same one they'd walked around years ago. On their last night before she left for New York, the moonlight danced across the water, and for a moment, it felt like time had folded back on itself. This place, Sarah whispered. You really don't forget anything, do you? He smiled. Not the things that mattered. They got out of the truck and stood by the water, the wind cool against their skin. The night was still, except for the gentle ripple of the lake and the soft beating of two hearts remembering how to feel. I used to come here after work, Ethan said quietly. When things got too heavy, it reminded me that even calm water has a story underneath. Sarah looked at him, her voice tender. And what's your story now? He turned to face her, trying to see if the ending can be rewritten. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither looked away. Sarah felt that same quiet pull she had the first night. That ache of something both familiar and new. You always knew how to say the right thing, she whispered. He shook his head. No, I just finally learned when to mean it. She smiled, her heart fluttering in that steady, grown-up way, not the wild rush of youth, but the deep, sure warmth of something real. The night deepened around them, stars reflecting on the surface of the lake. Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges. I found this while unpacking last week, he said, handing it to her. She opened it carefully. It was one of her old sketches, a charcoal drawing of him sitting at that very lake years ago. At the bottom, in tiny handwriting, she'd written, "For when I forget what peace looks like." Sarah's throat tightened. You kept this? Every move, every box, he said softly. Guess I couldn't let go of the one thing that still made me feel close to you." Her eyes shimmered. "Ethan." He stepped closer, not rushing, not forcing, just close enough that she could feel the warmth between them. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly. "I just needed you to know." She looked up at him, her voice trembling slightly. "I left once because I didn't know what I wanted, but tonight, I think I do." Ethan's eyes softened. "Yeah." She nodded, smiling through her tears. "Yeah." The moment hung there fragile, perfect, like a promise neither of them had to put into words. Then, as the wind brushed past them and the lake shimmered under the moon, Sarah whispered, "Maybe this was always where we were supposed to end up." Ethan took her hand gently, his thumb brushing over hers. "Maybe it's where we're supposed to start." And for the first time in a long time, Sarah didn't feel like she was running. Not from her past, not from love, not from herself. She was finally home the next morning. Sarah woke up feeling lighter than she had in years. Sunlight filtered softly through the curtains. And for the first time in a long time, her first thought wasn't about work or deadlines, it was about Ethan. About the quiet peace of last night by the lake. About his words, his warmth, and that steady look in his eyes when he said maybe it's where we're supposed to start. She smiled to herself, hugging the pillow close. It wasn't the wild rush of falling in love. It was gentler, deeper, like finding something that had been waiting all along. But as the morning went on, a new feeling crept in. Fear. What if this didn't last? What if it was just nostalgia, pulling them backward instead of forward? Sarah had built her life around control, planning every move, managing every detail. Love had never fit neatly into that. And Ethan, well, he had always been the one thing she couldn't plan for. She stood by the window, watching the rain begin again. "Don't overthink it," she whispered to herself. But she knew she would anyway. Later that day, while she was painting at the studio, her phone rang. It was Ethan. "Hey stranger," he said, his voice warm. "You busy tonight?" "Depends," she said, smiling. "What's the plan this time?" "I was thinking dinner. Real dinner, no takeout cups." She laughed. "You mean something that involves actual plates?" "Exactly. I'll even wear a shirt without paint stains." "Then, I can't say no, can I?" "Nope," he said cheerfully. 7 o'clock. Dress like it's the first time we're meeting again." The line went quiet for a second, just long enough for her heart to skip. "All right," she said softly. 7 it is. By the time evening came, Sarah was standing in front of her mirror, adjusting a simple navy dress. Her reflection looked calm, but her heart was racing. It had been a long time since she'd felt this kind of nervous, not because she was unsure, but because she finally cared again. When the doorbell rang, she took a breath before opening it. Ethan stood there, holding a small bouquet of daisies. "You look perfect," he said, almost shyly. She smiled. "You remembered my favorite flowers." "Of course," he said, handing them to her. "How could I forget?" Dinner was at a small, candlelit restaurant overlooking the harbor. The air smelled faintly of sea salt and rosemary. The lights from the boats outside danced across the window, and the gentle hum of quiet conversations filled the room as they sat across from each other. Sarah found herself studying him. The faint lines near his eyes, the way his hands rested easily on the table, the way he listened. He had grown older, steadier, more grounded, and maybe that's what she loved most. "So," Ethan said, breaking into her thoughts, "if this were our first date all over again, what would you want to know about me?" She smiled. "That's easy. I'd ask what makes you stay when life gets complicated." He thought for a moment. Maybe the right people make complicated feel worth it. Her heart fluttered. "That's a good answer." He grinned. "Your turn. What would I want to know about you?" She leaned forward slightly. "Probably the same thing, what makes me stay." And she held his gaze. "When it feels like home." For a long time, neither said anything. There was no need. Then Ethan reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. "Sarah, I know what this might look like to people trying to fix something old, but that's not what I want. I don't want to go back. I want to build something new with you." Her chest tightened. "Ethan, I'm not rushing you," he continued softly. "I just want you to know I'm here. This time, for real. No half-promises. No missed chances." Tears stung her eyes, though she smiled through them. "You always know exactly what to say, don't you?" He shook his head gently. "No. I just finally learned when not to lose you again." After dinner, they walked along the waterfront. The rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and cool. The moon shimmered on the water, and the city lights stretched out like a promise. Sarah slipped her hand into his, and he looked at her, not surprised, not unsure, just quietly happy. "I used to imagine this," Ethan said. Not the restaurant or the view. Just this walking next to you again, knowing you're really here. Sarah looked up at him. And how does it feel? He smiled. Like I've finally come home. They walked for a while without speaking, their hands entwined, the sound of the waves filling the quiet between them. At one point, Sarah stopped and turned to him. Ethan, can I ask you something? Anything. When you saw me that night after yoga, the night you offered me a ride, what made you stop? He looked at her for a long moment. Because when I saw you, it felt like the universe was saying, this is your second chance. Don't drive past it. Her breath caught, emotion rising in her throat. And now, he smiled. Now I'm just trying not to waste it. The wind swept through her hair as they stood there, two people who'd been broken, mended, lost and found. And in that moment, it didn't matter how much time had passed. What mattered was that somehow, they'd both made it back to the same place. At the same time, the city lights shimmered around them, and the water whispered softly against the shore. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice quiet. One drive home, she whispered, and everything changed. Ethan turned to her, his eyes full of something steady and sure. No, he said softly, you changed everything. The morning after their walk by the harbor, Sarah woke up to sunlight spilling across her room. It had been years since she felt this calm, like the world wasn't rushing her anymore. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the city wake up below. The air was crisp, golden light brushing over rooftops, and for once, she didn't feel like life was slipping past her. Ethan had texted her early. Ethan, good morning, sunshine, can I steal you for one last drive today? She smiled. One last drive. The words felt like both a promise and a question. Sarah, only if you promise not to let it be the last. Ethan, then it's a deal. That afternoon, he picked her up just like before. Same truck, same easy smile, same familiar warmth, but something in the air was different this time. Lighter, certain. Where are we going? She asked as he pulled out of the driveway. You'll see, he said, grinning. Just trust me. Sarah laughed softly. Famous last words. They drove for almost an hour, leaving the city behind. The road wound through green hills and small towns until it opened into a wide field with a view that stretched for miles. Golden grass, mountains in the distance, the kind of stillness that makes you breathe deeper. Wow, she whispered. It's beautiful. Ethan parked the truck, turning off the engine. I come here when I need to think, he said, or when I need to remember what really matters. Sarah smiled, looking out at the view. So, what are we remembering today? He looked at her quietly. That sometimes, we get a second chance, and we have to be brave enough to take it. The wind brushed through her hair, and for a moment, she couldn't look away. There was something in his eyes, not just love, but steadiness. Sarah, he said softly, you know I've never been great with big speeches, but there's something I need to say before I lose my nerve. Her heart began to race. Ethan, he smiled gently. When I saw you walking out of that art studio that night, I didn't think about what went wrong before. I just thought, maybe this is my sign that not everything ends for good. And since that night, you've reminded me what home feels like. Not a place, not a plan, but you. Sarah's eyes shimmered. Ethan, he took her hand, his voice steady. I don't know where this road takes us next. I just know I want to keep driving it with you. For a moment, the world was perfectly still, no sound but the rustle of wind and the quiet beating of two hearts, finding rhythm again. Sarah smiled through her tears. You have no idea how long I've waited to hear that. He smiled back. Then it was worth the wait. She took a deep breath. Ethan, I don't need promises. I just want honesty. If we're doing this, really doing this, I want it to be real. No pretending we're perfect. No trying to be who we used to be. Deal, he said softly. No pretending. Just us. They sat there for a while, no rush. No expectations, just two souls quietly finding their way back to something true. Finally, Sarah looked out at the road ahead. You know, she said, smiling, I used to think my life would change when I finally made it as an artist, or when I lived in a big city, but it changed the night you pulled up and asked if I needed a ride. Ethan turned to her. One drive home, and everything was different, she finished, laughing through her tears. He reached for her hand again, giving it a gentle squeeze. Then let's keep driving. The truck rolled down the open road, sunlight glinting off the windshield. Music played softly in the background, a song about love finding its way home. Sarah leaned her head against the window, smiling as the wind tangled through her hair. For the first time in years, she wasn't chasing anything. She was right where she was meant to be. And beside her, Ethan glanced over, smiling that same easy, familiar smile. The one that started it all. One drive, one chance, one moment that changed everything. Sometimes, the best stories don't begin with fireworks. They begin with a quiet offer, need a ride. And for Sarah and Ethan, that one drive home truly became the start of forever. The end.